January 17th, 1945. High noon over Berlin. The sun hung pale and cold above the Reich chancellery, casting sharp shadows across streets lined with rubble and false confidence. In the sprawling command bunker beneath Wilhelmstrasse, Luftwaffe officers studied maps marked with concentric rings, defense zones, flak batteries, fighter squadrons. The rings were supposed to be impenetrable. For nearly 6 years, the Reich Luftfahrt Ministerium had promised the German people that their capital would never burn in daylight, that the skies above Berlin belonged to the fatherland alone. But on this bitter January afternoon, as factory workers emerged for their midday rations and children played in bomb-scarred playgrounds, the air raid sirens began to wail. Not the familiar nighttime warnings they had learned to endure, but something new, something that arrived with the arrogance of noon. High above the frozen clouds, the drone of engines grew louder. American engines, flying fortresses, and they were coming in broad daylight. For the architects of the Third Reich, daylight was supposed to be sacred. It was the realm where German engineering reigned supreme, where Messerschmitt fighters could hunt with clarity, where flak gunners could track their targets with precision. Night belonged to the British with their area bombing and their darkness, but day was Germany's fortress, or so they believed. The truth arrived in waves of silver, 4-engined bombers flying at 25,000 feet, their contrails scratching white lines across the winter sky like signatures on a death certificate. The 8th Air Force had come to Berlin, and they had come when the sun was high. Berlin was not supposed to fall this way. It was not supposed to fall at all. Since 1940, Joseph Goebbels had woven a narrative of invincibility around the capital, broadcasting to the world that Berlin stood beyond the reach of enemy bombers, protected by the most sophisticated air defense system ever constructed. Flak towers rose like medieval fortresses from the city parks, reinforced concrete monoliths bristling with 128mm guns, their crews trained to fill the sky with steel. Fighter bases ringed the city in layers. Early warning radar stations tracked incoming threats hundreds of kilometers away. The Luftwaffe had pioneered much of this technology, had written the doctrine of air superiority. Hermann Göring himself had famously declared that if enemy bombers reached Berlin, "You can call me Meyer." It was a boast born of hubris, a promise made when German fighters ruled the skies over Poland and France, when Stukas screamed down on helpless columns, when the word blitzkrieg still carried the electricity of invincibility. But hubris is a currency that depreciates rapidly in war. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow. Its best pilots were dead over Russia or the Channel. Its fuel reserves were strangled by Allied bombing of synthetic oil plants. Its factories were scattered and starving for aluminum and rubber. The fighters that did scramble to meet the American formations often flew on fumes, their pilots teenagers with barely 50 hours of training, thrown into combat against veterans who had survived the gauntlet of Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The Berlin that the Americans approached in January 1945 was not the Berlin of 1940. It was a city that had learned to fear the night, to sleep in cellars, to wake to the smell of phosphorus and brick dust. But daylight had remained a refuge, a time when normalcy could pretend to exist, when trams still ran and offices still opened, and the illusion of control could be maintained.
The German defenders expected the Americans to respect the cost of daylight raids. They expected losses so heavy that the 8th Air Force would retreat to night operations like their British allies. They expected the mathematical brutality of attrition to protect Berlin as surely as any flak tower. And for a time, they were nearly right. The early American raids into Germany had been bloodbaths. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission in August 1943 cost 60 flying fortresses in a single day, 600 men dead, missing, or captured. The odds were grotesque. A bomber crewman in 1943 had roughly a 1 in 4 chance of completing his 25-mission tour. Every mission into Germany was a calculated massacre, a test of whether industrial production could replace men faster than flak and fighters could kill them. But the Americans did not retreat. They did not abandon daylight. They did something the German High Command had not anticipated. They adapted. They built more bombers. They trained more crews. And critically, they introduced the P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter that could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a detail that shattered every German defensive assumption. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe was fighting a war of mathematics it could not win. For every German fighter that rose to challenge the Americans, there were 10 Mustangs waiting. For every flak battery, there were formations flying altitudes that turned gunners into gamblers, firing into hope rather than certainty. The men inside those flying fortresses were cold. At 25,000 feet, even with heated flight suits, the temperature inside a B-17 hovered near 40 below zero. Ice formed on oxygen masks, gun turrets froze, fingers went numb inside thick gloves. The bombardiers hunched over their Norden bomb sites, making microscopic adjustments, calculating wind drift and altitude and the curvature of Earth itself. They were aiming at a city, but they were aiming with precision, or the pretense of it. The targets were listed as strategic: rail yards, government buildings, industrial complexes. But below, where the bombs would fall, there were also apartments and hospitals and bakeries and children. This was the moral calculus of total war, a calculus that no one in the air or on the ground could escape. What the German people experienced on that January afternoon was not merely destruction, it was humiliation. To be bombed at night was terrible, but it carried a kind of logic. Darkness was the realm of stealth and terror, of fires that spread unseen until whole blocks were ablaze. But to be bombed at noon, under a sky where you could see the bombers, count them, watch them pass overhead in their tight formations like a parade of death, that was something different. That was a demonstration. That was the enemy telling you that the sky no longer belonged to you, that the promises your leaders made were ash, that the vaunted Luftwaffe could not stop what was coming. Civilians crouched in bunkers and listened to the thunder of bombs walking across their city, each explosion a punctuation mark in a sentence that read, "You have lost." The flak batteries fired until their barrels glowed. The Würzburg radar stations tracked and calculated. The remaining Me-262 jet fighters, technological marvels that should have been game changers, scrambled when fuel allowed, but they were too few, too late, and their pilots were learning to fly revolutionary aircraft in the middle of a losing war. Some bombers fell, some crews died spinning down through frozen clouds, their parachutes tangled or burning, their bodies never recovered. But the formations held, the bombs fell, and Berlin burned in daylight.
The symbolism was inescapable, and Goebbels understood it immediately. Within hours, propaganda broadcasts began spinning the raid, recasting destruction as defiance, framing the burning capital as proof of Anglo-American barbarism rather than German defeat. But the people in the shelters knew better. They could hear the difference between rhetoric and reality. They could smell the difference. The smoke that poured from shattered buildings carried the scent of burning timber and melted tar, and something worse, something organic that no one wanted to name. The daylight raids continued through February, through March. Berlin was hit again and again, systematically, methodically, with the industrial efficiency that the Americans had perfected in their factories and now applied to destruction. What the German soldiers and citizens had expected was a fortress. What they received was a revelation. Fortresses are only as strong as the will and resources to defend them, and by 1945, both were exhausted. The strategic implications were catastrophic. Every bomb that fell on Berlin in daylight was a signal to the German command that air superiority, the cornerstone of their doctrine, the foundation of blitzkrieg, had inverted. The hunters had become the hunted. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Warsaw and Rotterdam and London, was now powerless to stop American teenagers from Kansas and California from flying over the Reich Chancellery at noon and dropping their payloads with impunity. There was a cruel irony embedded in this reversal. Germany had pioneered the concept of total war from the air, had demonstrated in Spain and Poland that terror bombing could break civilian morale and pave the way for ground forces. Now that doctrine was being applied to them, but with American industrial capacity behind it, a capacity so vast that it defied German comprehension. The Third Reich had built thousands of aircraft. The United States built tens of thousands. Germany drafted every able-bodied man. America sent bombers crewed by volunteers who had been farm boys and college students months earlier. The ideology of the Übermensch collided with the reality of the assembly line, and the assembly line won. For the Berliners huddled in their Hochbunkers and subway tunnels, the daylight raids destroyed more than buildings. They destroyed the narrative. Every promise of protection, every claim of technological superiority, every assurance that the Reich would stand for 1,000 years, all of it crumbled with the same certainty as the apartment blocks above them. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. To see enemy bombers in broad daylight, to watch helplessly as they carved up your city with geometric precision, was to confront a truth that no propaganda could obscure. The war was lost, and the suffering would continue until someone in power admitted it. The American crews who flew those missions did not feel triumphant. Many would later describe the sight of Berlin burning below them with a kind of numb detachment, a dissociation necessary to process what they were participating in. They were bombing a city. They were killing people who looked like their own grandparents, people whose crime was living under a regime they likely had little power to oppose. But they were also fighting a war against a regime that had industrialized genocide, that had started the conflict, that had visited this same terror on London and Coventry and 100 other cities. Moral clarity in total war is a luxury reserved for peacetime reflection. In the moment, at 25,000 feet, you followed orders, released bombs, and prayed your plane made it home.
The recurring image of those daylight raids, the symbol that veterans would carry for decades, was the contrails. Those long white lines scratching across the blue, visible for miles, beautiful in their geometry and terrible in their meaning. Contrails meant altitude, meant bombers, meant the sky was no longer a place of safety. German children learned to spot them, learned to read the sky like a warning system. A clear day with contrails meant sirens, meant running, meant hours in the dark waiting for the all clear. The contrails were a signature written by American engines across German skies, a mark of ownership, a declaration that the rules had changed. By April 1945, when Soviet forces were fighting street to street through Berlin's suburbs, the daylight bombing had largely ceased, not because the defenses had strengthened, but because there was little left to bomb. The city was a moonscape of rubble and craters, its population starving, its infrastructure destroyed, its leadership huddled in a bunker where delusions still flickered like dying candles. The impenetrable fortress had been penetrated so thoroughly that penetration itself became redundant. The Americans had proven their point not once but dozens of times, each raid a lesson in the futility of promises made by men who confused ideology with invincibility. The transformation this wrought in the German psyche would take generations to process.
The Wehrmacht soldier who had marched into Paris in 1940, who had believed in the technological and racial superiority his leaders preached, faced a reckoning in 1945 that was both military and existential. The Americans who bombed Berlin in daylight did not do so with supernatural weapons or superhuman courage. They did so with better logistics, better production, better strategy, and the accumulated weight of an economy that could afford to lose bombers and build more, that could train crews faster than attrition could kill them. It was not destiny. It was mathematics and industry and the political will to sustain horrific losses until the enemy's will broke first. In the end, the daylight bombing of Berlin was not remembered by the Germans as a military defeat. They had suffered too many of those by 1945 to single out one. It was remembered as the moment when the last illusions fell away, when the sky itself became a testimony to the regime's failure. The flak towers still stood, silent monuments to a doctrine that no longer mattered. The radar station still rotated, tracking ghosts, and in the streets, survivors picked through rubble under the same pale sun that had watched American bombs fall, their faces turned upward not in defiance, but in recognition of a simple, unbearable truth. The fortress had never been real. The Americans flew home, their bomb bays empty, their fuel gauges dropping, some trailing smoke, some with wounded aboard, all of them exhausted by the cold and the fear and the mechanical violence of it all. They did not celebrate. They marked another mission completed, another day survived. Many would fly again the next day and the day after until the war ended or they did. They were not ideologues. They were workers in the industry of war, and the product they delivered was the slow, grinding collapse of an empire built on lies. What fell over Berlin that January was not merely high explosive and incendiary. It was the weight of reality, delayed for years by propaganda and desperation, but inevitable as gravity. The declaration of impenetrability had been tested in the most literal way possible, and it had failed in broad daylight, where failure could not be hidden, could not be spun, could only be endured. And so Berlin burned, not in the darkness where terror thrives, but in the cold light of noon, where truth is inescapable.